So last session was about infrastructure and about business, and I guess across the two chapters it's probably fair to say that there's actually less evidence to go on than there is for other chapters, perhaps with health. There's plenty that needs to be done, both within infrastructure and across businesses in the UK to adapt to climate change. And just focusing on infrastructure first of all, obviously infrastructure is exposed to a range of different climate hazards. It's a whole long list there, from higher temperatures as well as low temperatures, snow and ice, as well as high winds, and water scarcity and water stress is key. And some of the lesser climate change risks that the first climate change risk assessment didn't really go into in much detail was around issues to do with subsidence and slope instability caused by heavy rainfall and higher and kind of lower temperatures causing shrink, swell, subsidence. Range of other kind of wider drivers of climate impacts and disruption as well for infrastructure to do with population growth, urbanisation, obviously higher expectations, I suppose, we as customers of infrastructure services have. We don't like disruption and delays, even though some, of course, are inevitable. Opportunities, but also create risks, an increase in trade and mobility, and also increasing efficiency within infrastructure networks, a kind of a just-in-time perspective, and trying to make sure that that kind of particular resources are available and things come online just when they're needed. It's very little kind of contingency and redundancy within infrastructure networks, which means that when assets are taken out by the weather, there isn't always backup services available, because obviously backup services cost money. So it comes a kind of cost-risk trade-off. When we look at the scorecard for the infrastructure chapter, though, it's really quite a positive picture, because we recognise there is a huge amount of effort going on across the different sectors in response to recent severe weather events. Certainly the PIT review in 2007 initiated a range of different activity across the sectors listed here on that scorecard to improve resilience, initially to flooding and sea level rise, but since about 2009-2010 that's extended into other natural hazards to do with heat waves and even things like wildfire, which may become more prevalent with climate change. But we want to in this chapter look at two main areas. First of all, the means and decisions around new infrastructure, where it's located, and whether the design of new infrastructure is taken. The series of national policy statements have climate change adaptation at their heart, and they make sure that decisions about location and design take account of the primary climate hazards. And when we looked at individual projects to see whether or not that's actually happening in practice, again, it's quite a positive picture that certainly projects are taking steps to increase allowances for heavy rainfall events, for sea level rise, for flood risk in particular. But I suppose there's less account, certainly, that we can observe being taken in terms of things like coastal change, I say about surface water flood risk, about shrink, swell, subsidence, and stronger winds potentially, if that's where the climate science is heading. So certainly a pretty positive picture around design, location and new infrastructure, but overall we do question whether or not over time you're creating an increasing risk of what we call systemic risk, because decisions on new infrastructure tend to be taken in isolation. They tend to be taken individually, obviously by the operators themselves, but also by the planning inspectorate. And whilst there's some kind of some vague terms within national policy statements to require planning inspectors to look at kind of things, kind of the cumulative impact of individual decisions, we don't really see much evidence of that being done in practice. So that's why progress has been given an amber for new infrastructure. We also looked at not just the resilience of infrastructure services as a overall in terms of the policy, primarily delivered by the Cabinet Office in combination with the lead government departments for all the different sectors. Again, pretty positive picture. But we looked for progress and policies within each of the different sectors to make sure that climate change is being taken into account. And certainly for the first few areas, it's very obvious that there's lots of action being taken. And in the energy sector, pretty much uniquely across the report, we see that not only is there plans and policies in place, that actions are happening, but actually the energy sector can provide us with information that shows that over time they expect the vulnerability of the distribution and transmission networks to fall, that they are systematically addressing the flood risk in particular to important substations, so that by the early 2020s there shouldn't be any kind of unprotected substations in areas of high flood risk. Obviously we know there's lots happening in the public water supply, water companies investing in resilience, particularly since the floods of 2007, but also in this most recent pricing round there is money in business plans for resilience projects. But across the industry, what we don't have is data that tells us how much has been achieved, both by as a result of investment over the last couple of years, but how much further improvement we can expect in the next 5 years because of the investment and the attention being paid by water companies. There isn't any consistent information or metrics that look across water company areas that tell us how much progress has been made as a result of investment that's been taking place. And I guess that's a common message across all these different sectors, that whilst we know there is good practice, whilst we know there is efforts being taken, we don't have sufficient data at the national level, other than in the energy sector, to tell us how much has been achieved and how likely it is for similar disruptions to the ones we've seen in past years to reoccur on a fairly frequent basis. And I suppose that's most apparent within the non-regulated sector, certainly non-regulated from a performance perspective. So ports and airports are commercial operations. They're obviously key to national infrastructure and service, the services like power and like water to a degree as well. But we don't know enough about what ports and airports are up to, and we actually assess progress is great because we just don't have enough evidence to tell whether or not the kinds of events we saw in 2013 that saw the tidal surge overwhelming the port of Birmingham and quite severe passenger disruption at the Gatwick Airport on Christmas Eve of 2013. We don't know whether that was a one-off and it won't never happen again, or it's the kind of thing that we might see more and more frequently. Roads and the rail network, both are kind of regulated now from a performance perspective by the Office for Road and Rail. Lots of investment taking place, but I think there's a real distinction here between the roads and the rail network in that the road network was built relatively recently to modern engineering standards. As a proper network, you can reroute traffic whenever there's disruption. Whereas on the rail network, it was built 150 years ago in many cases to varying engineering standards, let's say, or no engineering standards probably is more the case in some cases. And there is a huge legacy issue there. We know that severe weather disrupts rail. It happens every day. But the climate change will increase the exposure of not just coastal assets and stretches of track like at Dawlish, but also inland areas, in that most of the disruption that happened during the winter of 2013-2014 was actually outside of recognised flood risk areas because heavy rainfall and high winds caused trees to be felled and for landslips to take place, causing tracks and services to be lost, kind of outside of recognised flood risk areas. And certainly to this point in time, the rail network knows its historic problems. It knows where disruptions have been caused in the past, and it's got programs to address those issues. But it's still yet to really systematically assess from a climate change perspective what disruption it might see in the future and how much needs to be invested to avoid it. As I said at the very beginning of the session, we don't know yet enough about digital infrastructure. There may be no problem because digital infrastructure is a very new technology. It's replaced and renewed all the time. It's a proper network with inbuilt redundancy, and for example, data storage sites are mirrored so that if one gets taken out, usually services can be provided by its mirror twin located somewhere else, but also that disruption can happen in that when Hurricane Sandy struck New York, two data centers apparently that were 400 miles apart both got taken out, not just by the initial event, but also because fuel supplies ran short within a number of days. So it's not just the immediate impact of some of these events, but there can be longer term consequences as a result. We also looked at infrastructure interdependencies, recognizing that there is the risk of kind of cascading failures where if one network gets taken out, it can cause problems to others, in particular around energy and ICT, which are, obviously support mostly of the services that you have on this screen. And that really only get to the stage now where we understand where the kind of hotspots of vulnerability are, and we don't yet know enough about what action is being taken by government to address those hotspots. Just to reflect on a number of charts that essentially kind of underpin the overall messages that I've just been through. First of all, this chart shows the extent to which electricity substations are located in areas of high flood risk. But as I said, the energy network operators, the distribution companies, the transmission companies have got plans in place to address flood risk to electricity substations the next decade or so. So that's a picture that should improve over time. We've also seen that public water supply outages in general are falling. So certainly over the last couple of years there'll be fewer or less severe customer outages, loss of public water supplies. But what we don't know is to what extent severe weather plays a part in these kinds of disruptions, or whether or not kind of severe weather impacts are falling, because the water companies don't systematically record the cause of these events, or certainly don't say whether severe weather is the cause of these events. So we can't tell actually what's happening in that case. And this is a chart for Network Rail, again just to highlight the challenge that Network Rail has to bring the tens of thousands of kilometres of track across England to standards where severe weather will no longer cause a problem. Of course, severe weather will always cause disruption, so to some extent it's about how it's managed, but certainly the trend, if you look on the right hand side, the blue bars on the very right hand side show obviously year-to-year variability, but certainly over the last 5 years seems to be some kind of underlying and increasing trend behind passenger delayed minutes caused by weather and structural failures during weather. So lots to praise and to recognise within the infrastructure sector in terms of what's been happening in response to severe weather events in recent years, particularly in terms of the power sector and also in terms of the water sector. Lots happening within transport after the Brown Review of Transport Resilience that was published last year in response to the severe weather of 2013-2014. Good practice, for example, the Mellon Review for Gatwick Airport, in response to that Christmas Eve events which caused so much disruption to passengers, then investment going on to improve resilience and to avoid those kind of problems reoccurring. And the Cabinet Office is doing a lot kind of behind the scenes, not always in the public domain, but they have been commissioned to perform what's called an annual resilience review of infrastructure, and the last round of that review focused on interdependencies, again with recommendations from those reviews passed up to ministers to be addressed. But what we do need going forward, and the recommendations focus on this, really is about understanding what's actually taking place, how much progress is being made, and building better indicators of performance and of resilience so that we can tell whether or not enough is being done. So we can point to good examples. Everyone can talk about the projects that are taking place, but overall we can't step back and say, as a result of all of this activity, we're now less likely to see impacts and severe weather disruption in future. Moving on to business, again, this is a chapter which probably doesn't have enough evidence. We'd certainly like to have more data sets that tell us what's going on in this area, but we focused on four main adaptation priorities. First of all, looking at the business impacts of extreme weather, flooding in particular. We had a question earlier about the extent to which we take account of international effects on UK and on England, and we looked at this within the business chapter in terms of supply chain interruption, so shortages of natural resources or impacts on supply chains overseas and whether or not that could cause impacts in the UK. We looked at water demand by industry, and finally we looked at an area of opportunity for UK companies who might be operating in relevant areas which is about adaptation goods and services. whether it's about flood risk management products, water management products, about agri-technologies or other things which climate change creates. It creates new market opportunities for businesses in the UK to exploit and to grow their companies in that way. Again, to the extent that we can tell, based on the evidence we have, a pretty positive picture throughout, in that we know, for example, that businesses are increasingly taking up business continuity plans, having contingency arrangements in place for severe weather impacts in particular, but less is being done. Certainly less we can see and observe in terms of supply chain interruptions. And I think there's a big difference here between your kind of large multinational companies, the kind of brand names that we talk to all the time, like Marks and Spencer's and Nestle and Unilever and people like that, who clearly are taking a lot of action because they see it as a means to gain competitive advantage over time. And those companies, the smaller companies, the more specialist companies, niche companies, where either there's evidence that nothing much is happening, or actually we just don't know enough about what SMEs are up to. And so as we get into the charts, we can see that certainly large companies have business continuity plans in place. If you look at the chart, you see that about, or just over half of all private sector companies have some kind of a business continuity plan in place, but that number drops off quite a bit for kind of medium and small and particularly micro businesses. But where companies have a contingency plan and have had to execute it and bring it into place, they recognise the benefit of having one. So that's certainly, we see business continuity measures and plans as a kind of low regret action. It's the kind of thing that all companies should have, if at all possible. And I know that there's an emergency guidance and there's a business resilience health check tool, which is helping companies develop these kinds of plans. We also looked at data that we could get hold of from the Climate Disclosure Project, which tells us a bit about certainly what larger kind of multinational companies are doing to manage supply chain risks from overseas. Well, not just overseas, but particularly overseas supply chain risks. And of the companies that reported, the kinds of things that they're doing are, well, some which are only kind of looking into this for the very first time. So we've got some companies who are monitoring impacts only, or they're undertaking research, but some companies are actually taking action and, for example, diversifying their supply base from them. There's also action to provide guidance and tools to support both to suppliers and to customers. And again, business continuity plans come through from this, showing how important they can be. What do they do if the supply for a particular product dries up at short notice? So certainly there is some evidence, certainly, that supply chain risks are being managed, and I think hopefully this will be a few useful examples of the kinds of steps that certainly the larger companies are doing in response to that. I think I mentioned at the very beginning that one of the areas where we do see kind of indicators moving in the right direction is the water intensity of UK manufacturing. That certainly in terms of abstraction of fresh water from the environment, but also in terms of the amount of water consumed by UK businesses, both have been falling over the last decade or so. Year-to-year variation, of course, but certainly the trend is going in the right direction. But it has to be said that whilst there is evidence of some water efficiency measures being taken, particularly in the food and drink sector, I think a lot of this less heavy industry, an increase in movement towards a more of a service-orientated industry. So that's certainly an area that we don't want to take for granted, given that businesses are clearly a heavy user of fresh water, and that when we looked into particular water-intensive industries last year about chemicals, paper manufacturing and mining and quarrying, I think it was the chemicals manufacturing industry where there are actually a few large players, and actually they're co-located, including in water-stressed catchments. So across industries, I think particularly water-intensive industries should be thinking about where their sites are located and where they're going to be getting their water from, not just the next couple of years, but in decades to come. One of the areas the Environment Agency is concerned about is the apparent levelling off, not just in businesses, but actually in the residential space as well, about the kind of levelling off in uptake of flood warnings. Whether or not we've hit a kind of some kind of glass ceiling in the penetration of warnings being taken up. I mean, this is the chart just for businesses that shows that certainly there's been progress, and certainly there was a lot of progress between 2005 and 2009 in the proportion of businesses in high-risk areas taking up flood warnings, but that since about 2009, 2010, that's leveled off. The Environment Agency says that's partly because more and more businesses are relying on mobile phones, and they can't tie a mobile phone to a particular location to know whether that mobile phone's at risk of flooding. So that's something the Environment Agency is working on. But when we looked at this last year, we found that actually quite a small proportion of businesses that are signed up to flood warnings have actually done so proactively and have signed up to for the full flood warning service available from the Environment Agency. Most businesses that are registered have actually come through the kind of opt-out service where they're automatically registered and have to say whether they want to remain in the system or not. And of course, most people don't opt out. But they only get a reduced level of service if they are kind of automatically registered, as opposed to proactively saying, you know, we want to have the full flood warning service from the Environment Agency. So again, that's an area where we want to kind of follow up, because whilst we recognise there is progress being made in developing continuity plans, what we're not yet seeing is businesses adapting, certainly in terms of their operations and assets in the UK. They're not really investing in flood protection measures. We see good examples of businesses contributing towards flood defence projects, but they're still the exception rather than the norm, and certainly I think everyone recognises there is much more potential to tap into private investment to increase levels of flood protection across the country. We see some positive progress in terms of water use by industry, and we also recognise that there is considerable expertise within UK companies about helping in adaptation efforts, not just in this country but overseas. But we have to recognise that, you know, adaptation isn't necessarily the top priority for many businesses, and perhaps nor should it be if they've got more immediate pressures around, you know, creating products which people want to buy, and, you know, managing cash flow, managing employees, and everything else. But certainly we want to see more action by SMEs to develop business continuity plans, to invest in flood, to take up flood warnings, and to invest in flood. And also more the government can do, if we move on to the recommendations, more the government can do to promote growth in adaptation goods and services, and also to look into the systemic risks that a number of people have pointed to within the finance sector, where I guess it's fair to say that we don't know enough yet about, given the UK is heavily dependent on on the city, on the finance sector for our GDP. Is there some kind of systemic risk or risk of stranded assets that could cause a problem going forward? And it's one thing that we ourselves are looking into now. So those are the two final chapters of the report. Just looking at the time, we've only got a few minutes left for last round of questions, but I'll leave you with the overall summary of our first statutory report to Parliament. Back to you, Mike.